The new Warframe update just dropped, and we all know what that means. Trainman Vauban finally got not only his new heirloom skin, but also his rework, and man did they buff him. I'm talking millions of damage, room nuking capabilities, all while at the same time being basically untouchable. So, in this Warframe guide, we're gonna go over what Vauban can do now, and I have multiple different builds prepared. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now, let's go. First of all, as per usual, it is time to talk about Vauban's abilities, especially now after his rework, because quite a lot of things changed. However, before we get into the skills themselves, I want to make a quick disclaimer. I personally am no Vauban expert. I've never played him all too much, and I know that especially with him, there's a crazy amount of hidden synergies and interactions. So if you think I missed something important in the ability section, then let me know in the comments down below. Also, the rework just dropped, so there might be some bugs that will get fixed further down the line. And then, most importantly, when talking about the skills now, I'm not gonna go all too much into how they used to be before the update, but rather the way that Vauban is right now. And with that being said, let's finally get to the skills. And today, we're not gonna start out with a passive, but go right into the first ability, because I think this order makes more sense. So, skill number 1 goes by the name Tesla Nervos. When you cast this skill, you will throw out one little roller grenade. You can have up to 4 of these on the field at the same time, and if you want to, you can also just hold down the ability button for a while to throw out all 4 at the same time. These rollers will follow you around the battlefield, and when they come close to an enemy, they will latch onto that enemy, stunning them in the process, and periodically, every second, it will also create an electric shock AoE that has a chance to deal electricity damage and status effect to all nearby enemies. Overall, I think it's a decent ability, especially for crowd control, because with a lot of range, you can shock a whole bunch of enemies on the battlefield. Just keep in mind, if you're playing a game mode where you actually want the enemies to come towards you, then your team might end up low-key hating you if you spam this too much and stun the enemies in their path. Tesla Nervos also has an augment called Tesla Bank. This one is quite interesting. What it does is, when the grenade latches onto an enemy, that enemy will get a marker over their head and will then store all the damage that the enemy took. When the enemy is then killed, it will inflict this stored up damage in an AoE around it. One thing that is important to know here, if I understood it right, then this damage that is stored is not actually the numbers that you inflict towards the enemy, but the total amount of health that the enemy had left the moment the grenade latched onto them. Overall, I personally think Tesla Bank is quite a decent augment, but can't always realize the nuking capability in practice that it has when tested in the simulacrum. I think it's fine to use it, but for today's builds, we're actually not going to incorporate it. Okay, now it is time to talk about his passive, and this one is actually very darn good. What it does is, Vauban deals 25% more weapon damage to every enemy that is affected by some form of crowd control. This can be your crowd control, but also the CC from a teammate or whatever. What's important to note here is, this 25% is not base damage or anything, it is a final 25% multiplier, meaning if you would deal, for example, 100 damage to an enemy by default, then it will be 125 if that enemy is CC'd. As I said, this buff is applied against every enemy that is under some form of crowd control, and, very important to note, that is also why we didn't start with the passive, the electricity stuns inflicted by your Tesla Nervos, your little roller zaps, those enemies will also be considered as crowd controlled and benefit from the buff. The devs did say that in the future they want to make it that every type of electricity status will give this buff, but for the release version of the update right now, that change is not yet implemented and will probably come sometime in the future. Overall, given that Vauban is the main crowd control Warframe, this is a very welcome damage boost. Up next, I want to go on with his 4th ability, Bastille. I know the order seems kind of weird, but I think it makes more sense this way as the other abilities kind of sort of interact with this one. Bastille is your main crowd control tool, and it has 2 modes. If you tap the ability button, you will throw out a grenade that will create an AoE around it, in which enemies are stunned and lifted in the air. While enemies are in this field, they will automatically lose a portion of their armor over time until they are fully stripped. This crowd control, of course, only applies to enemies without overguard. However, even overguarded units will still lose armor while they're being in the field. Once the duration of this field ends, it will change into a vortex, pulling everybody into the center while ragdolling them and dealing magnetic damage to them. Now, alternatively, you can also just hold the ability button when you cast it. In that case, you will instantly create the vortex and it will linger on the field until the duration is over. Just one quick thing to note here, if you're already having these Bastille stunning fields out and then you hold the ability button, it will actually turn all of them into vortexes. So if you want to layer a vortex over a Bastille field, then what you gotta do is cast the vortex first and then the Bastille field over it. Doesn't work the other way around. Also, you can have 4 of these fields and 4 of these vortexes on the field at the same time. Another cool thing to note here is, while the enemies are being armor stripped inside your stunning field, you and your allies, when you're standing in the field, you will actually get a whole lot of bonus armor up to a maximum of 1,500. Once you leave the field, this armor will last for a while more. Bastille also has an augment called Repelling Bastille, and what this does is, when you take out enemies in the stunning field, then this will increase the duration, so you can basically keep this up constantly, and if you throw the vortexes out instead, then you can throw multiple on top of each other to increase the duration this way. Overall, I think if you're playing a stationary game mode where you want to hold a position for quite a while, this can be pretty convenient because you don't need to spam the abilities that much. But in more mobile gameplay scenarios, I don't think there's too much value in keeping up a field longer if that field ends up being on the other side of the map. I would say this augment comes down to personal preference. Up next, let's talk about ability number 3, going by the name Photon Strike. With this one, you throw out a targeting beacon, and then like half a second later, there's gonna be a ginormous orbital strike coming down on that position. Enemies in the AoE will take blast damage with a guaranteed status effect, and it also deals double damage versus overguard. However, that's not all. There's also a nice synergy between Photon Strike and Bastille, and that is, if you use the Vortex version, then the Photon Strike is automatically gonna target the center of the Vortex, so you can pull together a lot of enemies and then blast them with the Photon Strike. Oh yeah, and did I mention that Photon Strike deals scaling damage? Yep, that's right, the higher the enemy level, the more damage this thing deals, so it scales very nicely. Photon Strike also has an augment called Photon Repeater, and this is very nice if you want to make a build that incorporates Photon Strike. It's kind of sort of mandatory in my opinion, because what this does is, if your Photon Strike hits at least 5 enemies, then the next cast of it will cost no energy, and it will fire 2 additional strikes. Now, if you ask me, it is definitely viable and very fun to make a build around this ability, and we're also going to do that later in the video, but at the same time, I think this is the least useful ability in your kit in a day-to-day gameplay scenario, so I would say if you need to replace something with a helmet ability, Photon Strike is a good one to throw out. Whew! Finally, let's talk about ability number 2, Minelayer. This one is a handful. What Minelayer does is, you can throw out 2 different types of grenades. If you hold the ability button, you will throw the Vector Overdrive pad, which will put down a boost pad on the floor that gives you 2 buffs when you or an ally run over it. Number 1, it boosts your movement speed for a while, and number 2, you will get another 25% damage bonus to weapons. This 25%, and that is very important to note, it too is multiplicative to everything else. It is multiplicative to your normal damage output, but it is also multiplicative to the 25% damage that you gain from the passive. Meaning, even though 25% doesn't sound all too much, it is actually very strong. Oh yeah, and of course, if you have a higher ability strength, then your movement speed and this damage bonus will be even higher. However, that was only one of the 2 grenades that you can throw out, and the second one happens when you just tap the ability button, and this one is the Tether Flechette Orb. First of all, it tethers nearby enemies and pulls them in towards it. It, unfortunately, only grapples onto very few enemies, but the cool synergy here is, when you throw this one into a Bastille field, then it will let go of the enemies once they are in the Bastille field and switch over to target other ones that are still standing outside. This way, it will step by step pull all the enemies into the AoE of Bastille. The main thing about this one though is the Flechette Orb, and this is absolutely crazy. It has so many synergies, so I'm just probably gonna read out the wiki for a while now. First of all, what it does is you throw out a little grenade that will shoot bullets in all directions, dealing damage to enemies. However, unlike most other abilities, it is considered weapon damage. Flechette Orb has a 50% innate crit chance with a 2x critical multiplier and 5% status chance to inflict puncture status. On top of that, the damage of it also scales with enemy level, so it can basically take out everything, and because of the fact that it is sorta considered weapon damage, this means it can benefit from so many buffs. First of all, it gets the multiplicative 25% from your passive. Then it gets the multiplicative 25% from the other buff grenade that we just talked about, and it can basically benefit from absolutely everything that you see in the background right here, which, just in case you want to read out all of it, is the wiki section called Universal Weapon Bonuses. Just to name a few, you can massively increase the damage by using Arcane Arachne, giving 150% more damage on Wall Latch. Also, stuff like Holster Amp and Vigorous Swap will give you tons of damage too. Then you have all these abilities right here, and that is just the damage. On top of that, you can also increase the crit chance by both Arcane Avenger as well as Arcane Hotshot, which is actually very huge because you have a base of 50%, so plus 300% does do quite a lot. And then the crit damage bonus benefits from Arcane Crepuscular, Tenacious Bond, and there are so many more interactions. I'm just gonna refer you to the wiki section right here in case you want to know about everything, because otherwise we would still be sitting here in an hour. Long story short though, what this means is, this Flechette Orb can deal millions upon millions of damage, and it doesn't care about enemy level because it is scaling damage. This is easily the strongest damage dealing tool in your kit. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that'll be super nice because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. Cheers so much for your support. Now, that was quite a lot about the abilities. So how about we take a look at the builds now, starting out with something simple with a beginner-focused build. You know, in case you just got the heirloom skin and you're not that far in the game yet, here's something nice that you can build to try him out. First of all, just as a quick side note, there are a lot of forma and even more omniforma on this build. It does not mean that you need to put all these forma on the build, it's just something that I did so I could try out multiple other builds. This one here doesn't need a lot of investment. As for the build, in the aura, you can use whatever you like. I just went for Dreamer's Bond because it's a beginner build. And then for the rest here, we're gonna go with something nice and balanced. We'll go for a little bit of ability strength with Intensify, quite some decent range with Stretch and Augur Reach, because, you know, Vauban is the AoE frame, so the more range you have, the bigger the AoE of your Bastille. That is always nice. And also, in general, range on him is really great. In case you already have Overextended, then I would highly recommend incorporating that as well, but if not, then Stretch and Augur Reach should do for the time being. The energy economy comes from Equilibrium for the energy income, and then Flow to have more maximum energy. And another thing that you really want to have with him for convenience sake is much duration, because the higher the duration, the longer everything lasts. So we go with continuity as well as Augur Message. And then finally, to stay alive, you can of course go into health tanking. That's actually a pretty decent idea because you gain so much armor when you stand in your Bastille field. But alternatively, you can also just slap on redirection to get a lot of shields. You can kind of try out both and see which one works best for you. But let's now talk about the Steel Path builds, and here I have two different ones prepared for you. The first one is a Flechette Orb build, which focuses on dealing millions of damage with your little Flechette Orb. And then the second one is super duper fun, where you will spam Photon Strike to rain death upon the enemy. All in all, Vauban is really versatile, and you can build him in a lot of different ways, so don't take my builds here as be-all end-all. There are so many more other possibilities. With this one, our goal is to deal as much damage with the Flechette Orbs as possible. Remember what we said in the skill section? This orb is weapon damage and benefits from tons and tons of different buffs. Well, this type of buff stacking is exactly what's gonna happen now. First of all though, let's take a look at our helmet ability. Of course, there are a lot of great options here. But for this one, I did the boring and went for Nourish because A, it solves all our energy issues, and B, it gives us nice passive viral priming, plus, and that is the great part, because our Flechette orb is considered like a sort of weapon thingy, the orb is going to benefit from your damage increase, and also it gains the ability to inflict the occasional viral status effect. Oh yeah, and by the way, your Vortex that pulls in the enemies from your 4th ability, that kind of sort of also benefits from Nourish, so with this one you will see the occasional viral priming too. Next, let's also take a look at the Archon shards here, and what I did is I went for 3 purple ones, all into more ability damage against enemies affected by electricity. This ability damage increase is a multiplicative bonus which applies to the final damage number, so that is very, very strong. And of course, because our first ability Tesla Nervos inflicts electricity on basically everybody around, that means a lot of enemies will constantly get this higher damage from our skill. The other 2 right here are kind of flex slots. I went for more ability duration for the convenience, but you could also go for more ability strength, you could go for more maximum energy if you don't want to mod for flow, or another nice thing if you spam a lot of abilities, go for yellows for more casting speed. Now, let's get into the Vauban build itself, and for this Flechette focused build, I actually have 2 different versions, Flechette 1 and Flechette 2. I'm gonna explain what the difference here is in just a minute, however, let's just first jump into the build right here. What I focused on is going for a lot of range because of the same reasons that I mentioned previously. More range means, more AoE on basically everything. That is very nice. For survivability, I went for a shield tanking approach with primed redirection, adaptation, and arcane aegis to give me constant shield regeneration. That is very nice, but you can of course also build him in a health tanking due to all the armor that you get from your 4. You can also build shield gating. It comes down to personal preference. There is no objectively right choice here. For the ability range, we go with Cunning Drift, Overextended, and Archon Stretch. Archon version here, obviously, because you gain 2 energy regeneration per second if you deal electricity with abilities. That is a given with our first, and given the fact that we have Nourish, which boosts energy income, this means with Nourish and Archon Stretch alone, that's already enough to solve all our energy issues. Growing power in the aura for more ability strength, but you can really use whatever you want. For example, you could also go for corrosive projection, reducing enemy armor even further, making them a faster kill. It comes down to personal preference. Then Blind Rage and Transient Fortitude for more ability strength, aka more damage, higher buffs with all our orbs, that is much appreciated, and then Prime Continuity for some additional duration for convenience. Now, the interesting part about this build happens when we take a look at the arcanes. First of all, we go for Arcane Hotshot. This one will give us up to 300% weapon critical chance, and as I previously mentioned, the Flechette orb is considered a weapon with a base crit chance of 50%, so if you have this one right here, you're gonna end up at a total of 200% crit chance, so guaranteed orange. Thing however is, Arcane Hotshot only triggers if you inflict heat status effect with abilities. And unfortunately, Vauban himself doesn't deal anything with heat. So, what are we gonna do? For this one, we're gonna go into our companion selection and equip Diriga. The reason why we go for Diriga is because of his skill Arc Coil, which we all know and love, where he zaps nearby enemies. Because if you combine that with Manifold Bond, then Arc Coil will inflict all the status effects that you have modded onto your companion weapon right here onto the enemy as well. As you see here, I have the Volcax, which deals heat and magnetic. And because of the fact that the Volcax deals heat, and that Arc Coil here taxes that heat onto the enemy, this is then considered by Arcane Hotshot on Vauban as heat status effect inflicted with ability. Even though we ourselves didn't do anything, Diriga can still stack this one up and keep it at a constant 50 stacks. Diriga is of course not the only companion who can do that. Other companions with Manifold Bond can do it as well, but I personally think that Diriga is the most convenient option here. This would be the first option to make this build, and you're gonna deal some disgusting crits into the millions. However, we can crank that up a little bit more with our Flechette Orb 2 build. As you can see here, most of the mods remain the same, but some things changed. First of all, one thing that I want to mention here is I used Augur Secrets here for ability strength. Ideally, you would want to use Umbral Intensify, but I just don't have the mod capacity, and on this build I would need an Umbra format to make it happen. I just didn't want to do the investment, so if you wanted to go all out, that is the one change that you should make here. The rest of the mods here remain kind of unchanged, with one exception, and that would be Vigorous Swap. This one gives you 165% weapon damage whenever you switch weapons, and this weapon damage, as I previously mentioned, applies to the Flechette Orb too, giving it a crazy damage bonus. But just in case, if it's too cumbersome for you, you could swap this one out for something else, although you would lose some damage. The main difference for this build right here is the way that we buff up the crit of our Flechette Orb. Remember in the first one, we got the crit chance from Arcane Hotshot? Well, here we crank the damage up even more. First of all, crit chance buff, we get that from Arcane Avenger. With a base of 50% and Arcane Avenger, that means we have 95% crit chance. However, for this one, we're going to crank up the crit damage as well by using Arcane Crepuscular, which gives us 30% more ability strength when invisible, and a final 3 times crit damage multiplier. With the base of 2 that we have, this one will bring it up to 5 times. Question here though is, how are we gonna get invisible? And there are multiple options. If you wanted to, you could swap out the Subsume ability to Cydo9's Evade, that would work. But the way that I went for here, I think it's much more convenient, and that is with a different companion, and that would be Shade. Shade makes you invisible whenever you're close to enemies, and this invisibility will last as long as you don't use weapons. However, abilities are fair game, and all we do here is use abilities, so this one is gonna keep us invisible constantly. Theoretically, you could also use the Huras Kubro, this one right here, because it also has this stalk ability which makes you invisible just like Shade, but the Huras Kubro can also attack while being invisible, and that opens up nice possibilities. For example, you could give him a Assassin's Posture, which will make him focus on Eximus units and everything with Overguard. That is nice because those enemies are the only ones who are not affected by your crowd control, just as a little option here. Now, one last important thing to mention here, because we're going to be constantly invisible, that means we have to use Combat Discipline to damage ourselves, which will then trigger Arcane Avenger. And the reason why I don't have any mod capacity here is, if you do this, you want to go for a rank 0 Combat Discipline, only giving you 1 damage instead of 10 if you max it out. Because if you max this out, you're just instantly gonna die. You're taking too much health damage from this, and yeah, you don't want that. But yeah, that would be the build focused on your Flechette Orb. It's super duper strong, great crowd controlling capabilities, one of my favorites for sure. Let's next though talk about another very strong build, and that would be the Photon Strike Nuke. This one focuses on basically spamming your Photon Strike, your third ability, everywhere and just blow up the entire map. It works surprisingly well. I was kind of shocked myself. First of all, let's also talk about the Helmet ability. What we do right here is pretty boring as well. We go for Rhino's Roar. Why Rhino's Roar? And with Rhino's Roar, the ensuing blast explosion is going to be much stronger. For the Archon shards, I kind of sort of do the same. Again, the purple ones, so we deal more ability damage against the enemies. The other ones, again, are flexible. Let's now take a look at the build itself. In the aura, I go for Corrosive Projection to reduce enemy armor. Then, the Exilus is kind of sort of whatever you want. I went for Cunning Drift because it gives me a little bit more ability range. For the stats, we focus on a whole lot of ability strength, because we want to have more buff from Rhino's Roar, and because we want to deal more damage with Photon Strike, and more strength just makes sense. If you wanted to, you could also go for Transient Fortitude, but I personally didn't want to sacrifice the ability duration just for that little bit of more ability strength. Then, because we're heavily focused on Photon Strike, we're going to use the Photon Repeater Augment because it will be very good for our energy economy, having basically all the casts for free and dealing more Photon Strikes to kill even more enemies. This one for this build is definitely a must-have. And then also here, I go for a shield tanking approach with Arcane Expertise to buff up my shields, and then Adaptation to, have some more survivability. And yeah, the way this works is very simple. You throw your 4th ability with the Vortex mode to group up a lot of enemies, and then just spam your Photon strikes into the blob, dealing tons of damage and just blowing up the entire map. It works very, very well, as you also see in the background. Just one important note. If the enemy has full armor, then it's a little bit more difficult to one-shot them with the Photon Strike, which means either you will have to layer the Vortex on top of the Bastille field to armor strip the enemy, but that's a little bit cumbersome in my opinion, so what I did instead is, I just let them have their armor, and instead, when it comes to the companion, I go for the Panzerwelpe because the Panzerwelpe with its viral quills can basically viral prime the entire room. And if the enemies have 10 viral stacks on them, then it doesn't matter if they have armor or not, they're just gonna die by the Photon Strike and everything is gonna be nice and dandy. And if you want to see a full tier list of every Warframe, then don't miss out this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Underkane02, Skylar Bowser, Mihawky, Circuitus the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hantares, Patrasader, Boomia1, Mr. Gamesplays, Zave, Awendai, Azengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.